I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside my window, a bittersweet reminder of the beautiful world beyond the walls of this suffocating house. The digital clock on my nightstand read 5:30 a.m., and I sighed, knowing that another day of walking on eggshells was about to begin. My name is Linda, and this has been my life since I married Ethan 3 years ago. As I stretched and got out of bed, I couldn't help but glance at the empty space beside me. Ethan was probably passed out on the couch again after another late night of drinking with his buddies. I shook my head, pushing away the disappointment that threatened to overwhelm me. There was no time for self-pity. I had a household to run. I tiptoed down the hallway, careful not to wake Margaret, my mother-in-law, who had taken up permanent residence in our guest room after her husband passed away last year. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and I held my breath, praying she wouldn't hear. The last thing I needed was another confrontation before I'd even had my morning coffee. The kitchen was my sanctuary, the one place in this house where I felt some semblance of control. I moved around quietly, setting up the coffee maker and pulling out ingredients for breakfast. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and for a moment, I closed my eyes, savoring the aroma and the peace. As I spread strawberry jam on my toast, I heard the telltale sound of Margaret's slippers shuffling down the hallway. My shoulders tensed involuntarily, and I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "Linda." Margaret's shrill voice pierced the morning calm. "Where's my coffee? And my toast? Don't tell me you're so selfish you only made breakfast for yourself." I turned to face her, forcing a polite smile. "Good morning, Margaret. I just finished making the coffee. Would you like me to pour you a cup?" Margaret's eyes narrowed, her lips pursed in disapproval. "I shouldn't have to ask. You know I take my coffee at precisely 6:15 every morning. It's 6:17 now. Are you trying to ruin my entire day?" I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to point out that she was perfectly capable of making her own coffee. Instead, I reached for a mug and began pouring. "I'm sorry, Margaret. It won't happen again." As I handed her the steaming cup, she snatched it from my hands, nearly spilling the hot liquid. "And my toast? Do I have to do everything myself around here?" Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or the constant barrage of criticism, but I couldn't take it anymore. "You know what, Margaret? Yes, you can make your own toast. I'm not your servant." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, Margaret's face contorted with rage. Before I could react, she hurled the coffee cup at me. I ducked, and it shattered against the wall behind me, leaving a dark stain on the pale yellow paint. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Margaret hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You ungrateful little brat. After everything we've done for you, taking you in when your own family couldn't stand the sight of you." I felt the sting of her words, knowing they were designed to hurt me where I was most vulnerable. My family's rejection was still a raw wound, one that Margaret never hesitated to prod. "That's enough, Mom," Ethan's voice came from the doorway. For a brief moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, he would stand up for me this time. But as I turned to look at him, I saw the familiar smirk on his face. He was enjoying this, reveling in the drama and the pain it caused me. "Linda, you shouldn't provoke her like that. You know how Mom gets when she doesn't have her morning routine." I stared at him in disbelief. "Provoke her?" "Ethan," she threw a cup at me. He shrugged, walking past me to pour himself a cup of coffee. "Well, if you'd just done what she asked in the first place, none of this would have happened." I felt something break inside me at that moment. This man, who had once promised to love and protect me, was now my biggest tormentor. I looked from Ethan to Margaret, seeing the triumph in their eyes, and I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. Without a word, I grabbed a dustpan and began cleaning up the broken pieces of the cup. As I worked, I could hear Margaret and Ethan chatting and laughing, as if nothing had happened. To them, this was just another morning, another opportunity to remind me of my place in their world. But as I swept up the last shard of porcelain, I made a silent vow to myself. This would be the last time they treated me like this. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to find a way out of this nightmare. I finished cleaning and stood up, my back straight and my head held high. Margaret and Ethan barely spared me a glance as I walked out of the kitchen. I headed to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. As I stared at my reflection in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman looking back at me. Her eyes were dull, her face drawn and pale. But there was something else there too, a spark of determination that I hadn't seen in a long time. I splashed some cold water on my face and took a deep breath. Today was going to be different. Today, I was going to start taking back control of my life. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't continue living like this. As I left the bathroom, I could hear Margaret complaining loudly about the quality of the coffee, and Ethan's placating responses. I walked past the kitchen without a word, heading for the front door. I needed some air, some space to think. The morning sun was warm on my face as I stepped outside. Our neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with only the occasional jogger or dog walker passing by. I started walking, not really sure where I was going, but knowing I needed to get away from that house, even if just for a little while. As I walked, I thought about how I'd ended up in this situation. I'd met Ethan 5 years ago, when I was fresh out of college and struggling to find my place in the world. He'd seemed so charming, so sure of himself. He promised me the world, and I, naive and desperate for love, had believed him. The first year of our marriage had been good. We'd been happy, or at least I thought we had. But then Margaret moved in, and everything changed. Ethan became distant, more interested in pleasing his mother than in being a husband. And Margaret, well, she made it clear from day one that she didn't think I was good enough for her precious son. I found myself at the local park, sitting on a bench overlooking a small pond. A family of ducks swam by, the mother leading her ducklings in a neat line. I watched them, envying their simple, peaceful existence. As I sat there, I realized I had a choice to make. I could go back to that house, apologize for my behavior, and continue living under Margaret and Ethan's thumb. Or I could stand up for myself, demand the respect I deserved, and face whatever consequences came with that decision. The thought of confronting them terrified me. But the thought of spending the rest of my life as their verbal punching bag terrified me even more. With a deep breath, I stood up and began the walk back home. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do or say, but I knew one thing for certain: things were going to change, starting today. As I approached our house, I saw Ethan and Margaret getting into his car, probably heading out for their usual Saturday brunch. They didn't even notice me as they drove past, too engrossed in their conversation. I watched the car disappear around the corner, feeling a strange mix of relief and determination wash over me. I had the house to myself for a few hours. Time to think, to plan, to figure out my next move. I walked back into the house, my steps feeling lighter than they had in months. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to be anyone's doormat anymore. As I made myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, I allowed myself a small smile. The morning's disrespect had awakened something in me, a strength I'd forgotten I possessed. And now, it was time to put that strength to use. As I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and enjoying the rare moment of solitude, my mind raced with possibilities. The house felt different without Margaret's constant criticism and Ethan's indifference hanging in the air. It was as if I could breathe freely for the first time in years. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 10:30 a.m. Ethan and Margaret wouldn't be back from their brunch at the Willow Tree Cafe for at least another hour. The Willow Tree was their favorite spot in our small town of Millbrook, known for its overpriced mimosas and gossip-filled atmosphere. It was the perfect place for Margaret to show off her designer outfits and for Ethan to network with the local elite. With a sigh, I stood up and walked to the living room window. Our house, a 2-story colonial that Margaret often complained was too small for a family of our status, sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Mrs. Johnson, our elderly neighbor, was tending to her prized roses. She caught my eye and waved, a kind smile on her face. I waved back, feeling a pang of guilt. Mrs. Johnson had always been nice to me, often inviting me over for tea, but Margaret had forbidden me from wasting time with that old biddy. As I turned away from the window, my eyes fell on a framed photo on the mantel. It was from my wedding day, Ethan and I, smiling broadly, with Margaret standing just behind us, her hand possessively on Ethan's shoulder. I picked up the frame, studying the faces. Was I ever truly happy, or had I just convinced myself I was? I set the photo face down on the mantel and walked to the bookshelf. Hidden behind a row of Margaret's self-help books was a small, leather-bound journal, my secret lifeline. I pulled it out and settled onto the couch, flipping through the pages filled with my cramped handwriting. For the past year, I'd been documenting everything, every insult, every manipulation, every time Ethan chose his mother over me. At first, it was just a way to vent my frustrations, but as time went on, I realized it could be something more. It could be my way out. With trembling fingers, I reached for my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for, Sarah Matthews, an old college friend who now worked as a lawyer in the city. We hadn't spoken in months, not since Margaret had accidentally deleted all my contacts from my phone, claiming she was just trying to help me organize it. I took a deep breath and hit the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as I was about to lose my nerve, Sarah's voice came through the speaker. "Linda, is that you?" I felt tears spring to my eyes at the sound of her voice. "Sarah, hi. Yes, it's me. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was filled with concern. "Linda, what's going on? Are you okay?" I took a shaky breath. "No, I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for a long time. But I'm ready to do something about it." Over the next half hour, I poured out everything to Sarah, the constant emotional abuse from Margaret, Ethan's neglect and complicity, the isolation, the fear. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. For so long, I'd kept all of this bottled up inside, afraid to speak the truth even to myself. Sarah listened quietly, only interrupting occasionally to ask for clarification. When I finally finished, there was a long silence. "Linda," Sarah said, her voice serious, "what you're describing is abuse. Emotional and psychological abuse. You need to get out of there." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I know. But it's not that simple. I don't have any money of my own. Ethan controls all our finances. And Margaret, she has connections all over town. She's made it clear that if I ever tried to leave, she'd make sure I had nowhere to go." "That's where I come in," Sarah said, determination in her voice. "Linda, do you still have that journal you mentioned? With all the documentation?" "Yes," I replied, clutching the book to my chest. "Good. That's going to be crucial. Here's what we're going to do." As Sarah laid out her plan, I felt a mix of terror and exhilaration. It wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be pretty, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. We talked for a while longer, working out the details. By the time we hung up, I had a clear plan of action. It would take time to set everything in motion, but I was committed. No more cowering, no more apologizing for existing. It was time to take back my life. I hid the journal back in its spot just as I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Quickly, I moved to the kitchen, grabbing a sponge and pretending to clean the already spotless counter. The front door opened, and Margaret's voice filled the house. "And did you see what Sharon was wearing? That dress must have been at least 2 seasons old. It's like she's not even trying anymore." Ethan's non-committal grunt was the only response as they entered the kitchen. Margaret's eyes immediately locked onto me, her gaze critical as always. "Well, I see you managed not to burn the house down while we were gone," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I suppose that's some sort of accomplishment for you." I kept my eyes on the counter, scrubbing at an imaginary spot. "I hope you enjoyed your brunch," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Ethan walked past me to the fridge, not even acknowledging my presence. As he reached for a beer, Margaret clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Ethan, darling, it's barely noon. Don't you think it's a bit early?" He shrugged, popping the cap off the bottle. "It's 5 o'clock somewhere, right?" He chuckled at his own joke, taking a long swig. I felt Margaret's eyes on me, waiting for a reaction. In the past, I might have said something, might have tried to reason with Ethan. But not today. Today, I kept my mouth shut and my eyes down. Linda, Margaret said, her voice sickly sweet, be a dear and fetch my reading glasses from the living room. I seemed to have misplaced them. I knew for a fact that her glasses were in her purse. I'd seen her use them at breakfast. But I nodded, setting down the sponge. Of course, Margaret. As I walked to the living room, I could hear them whispering behind me. No doubt Margaret was complaining about my attitude again. Let her, I thought. It doesn't matter anymore. I pretended to look for the glasses, taking my time. When I returned to the kitchen, Margaret was sitting at the table, Ethan beside her. They both looked up as I entered, their conversation cutting off abruptly. I'm sorry, Margaret, I said, my voice the picture of innocence. I couldn't find your glasses in the living room. Are you sure that's where you left them? Margaret's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting I'm forgetful, Linda? I distinctly remember leaving them on the coffee table. I shrugged helplessly. Maybe they fell behind the couch. Would you like me to look again? No, Margaret snapped. I'll do it myself since you seem incapable of a simple task. She stood up, shooting me a glare as she stormed out of the kitchen. Ethan sighed, taking another swig of his beer. Do you always have to antagonize her, Linda? You know how she gets. I bit back the retort that sprang to my lips. Instead, I simply said, I'm sorry, Ethan. I'll try harder. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. That's all I ask. You know Mom means well. She just wants what's best for us. I turned back to the sink, fighting to keep my expression neutral. If only he knew what was coming. If only they both knew. As I stood there, listening to Margaret's frustrated muttering from the living room and Ethan's quiet belches, I felt an odd sense of calm settle over me. The storm was coming, but for now, everything was quiet. And in this moment of calm, I was gathering my strength, preparing for the fight of my life. I glanced out the kitchen window, watching as a group of birds took flight from the old oak tree in our backyard. Soon, I thought. Soon, I'll be free too. The next few weeks passed in a blur of secret phone calls, hushed conversations, and careful planning. Sarah had been true to her word, working tirelessly behind the scenes to set everything in motion. I'd managed to sneak out a few times under the guise of grocery shopping to meet with her and sign the necessary paperwork. Each time I returned home, my heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement, I half expected Margaret to be waiting for me, ready to accuse me of some imagined transgression. But for once, luck seemed to be on my side. It was a crisp autumn morning when everything finally came to a head. I woke up early, as usual, my stomach churning with nervous anticipation. Today was the day. I went through my morning routine mechanically, making coffee, preparing breakfast, all the while listening for the sound of tires on the driveway. Margaret came downstairs at her usual time, her face set in its perpetual frown. I hope you remembered to buy more of that French roast coffee, she said by way of greeting. The swill you made yesterday was barely drinkable. I nodded, keeping my eyes down. Yes, Margaret. I picked some up yesterday. She sniffed disapprovingly but said nothing else as she poured herself a cup. Ethan stumbled in a few minutes later, looking hungover and irritable. He grunted in my general direction before slumping into a chair at the table. Ethan, darling, Margaret cooed, her tone changing instantly. Are you feeling all right? You look a bit peaky. He waved her off. I'm fine, Mom. Just didn't sleep well. I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to point out that his not sleeping well probably had more to do with the amount of whiskey he'd consumed the night before than any actual insomnia. Instead, I quietly placed a plate of toast and eggs in front of him. The morning crawled by at an agonizing pace. Margaret spent most of it on the phone, gossiping with her friends and planning some charity event she was in charge of. Ethan disappeared into his home office, emerging only to grab another cup of coffee or to complain about a work email. I kept myself busy with household chores, all the while watching the clock. At precisely 11:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. They're on their way. ETA 20 minutes. Are you ready? I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed back a simple yes. This was it. There was no turning back now. At 11:45, I heard the sound of multiple cars pulling up outside. My heart leapt into my throat. From the living room, I heard Margaret's shrill voice. Ethan, there are cars outside. Are we expecting company? I stepped out onto the front porch just as 5 men in impeccably tailored black suits emerged from 3 sleek, black sedans. They moved with a quiet, efficient purpose that immediately commanded attention. I saw our neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, peek out from behind her curtains, no doubt wondering what all the commotion was about. Ethan and Margaret came bursting out of the house behind me, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. What is the meaning of this? Margaret demanded, her voice rising to a near screech. Who are these people? One of the men, tall with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. Mr. Ethan Bradshaw, he asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Ethan nodded, his face pale. Yes, that's me. What's this about? The man reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Mr. Bradshaw, I'm Agent Carlson with the FBI. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. The world seemed to slow down as I watched the color drain from Ethan's face. Margaret let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat. This is preposterous, she sputtered. There must be some mistake. Agent Carlson's expression remained impassive. I assure you, Mrs. Bradshaw, there is no mistake. We've been building this case for months. He turned to 2 of the other agents. Please escort Mr. Bradshaw to the car. We'll need to search the premises as well. As the agents moved towards Ethan, Margaret whirled on me, her eyes blazing with fury. You, she hissed. You did this, didn't you? You ungrateful little witch. I stood my ground, meeting her gaze steadily. No, Margaret. Ethan did this to himself. I just made sure he couldn't hide from the consequences anymore. Ethan's head snapped up at my words, his eyes wide with disbelief. Linda, what are you talking about? I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Did you really think I was as naive as you believed? That I didn't notice the late-night phone calls, the mysterious bank transfers, the business trips that never seemed to have any actual business attached to them? Ethan's face contorted with rage. He lunged towards me, but one of the agents quickly stepped between us, restraining him. You backstabbing bitch, he spat. After everything I've done for you. I couldn't help but laugh, a sound that seemed to startle everyone present. Everything you've done for me? You mean isolating me from my friends and family? Allowing your mother to belittle and abuse me day after day? Treating me like a servant in my own home? Margaret made a sound like a wounded animal. How dare you? We took you in when no one else wanted you. We gave you a life of luxury. A gilded cage is still a cage, Margaret, I replied, feeling years of pent-up anger and resentment finally breaking free. And I'm done being your prisoner. Agent Carlson cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. Mrs. Bradshaw, he said, addressing me, we'll need to ask you some questions as well. But for now, I suggest you step back and let us do our job. I nodded, moving to the side as the agents began to lead Ethan away. He struggled against their grip, his face a mask of hatred as he glared at me. You'll regret this, Linda, he shouted. I'll make sure you have nothing when this is over. I watched impassively as they put him in one of the cars. Margaret was still standing on the porch, her body shaking with sobs. Part of me wanted to feel sympathy for her, but I squashed that impulse down. She had made her choices, just as Ethan had. As 2 of the agents began to cordon off the house with yellow tape, I felt a gentle hand on my arm. I turned to see Sarah standing beside me, a look of concern on her face. Are you okay? She asked softly. I took a deep breath, considering the question. Was I okay? My world had just been turned upside down. The man I had once loved was being taken away in handcuffs. The life I had known for the past few years was crumbling around me. And yet... Yes, I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. I think I am. Sarah squeezed my arm reassuringly. You did the right thing, Linda. It wasn't easy, but it was right. I nodded, watching as the agents continued their work. Mrs. Johnson had ventured out onto her lawn, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Other neighbors were starting to gather as well, drawn by the commotion. I could already hear the whispers starting, could see the shocked looks and pointing fingers. But for once, I didn't care what they thought. Let them talk. Let them speculate. I knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. Agent Carlson approached us, his expression serious. "Mrs. Bradshaw, we'll need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. Is there someone who can accompany you?" I looked at Sarah, who nodded without hesitation. "I'm her lawyer," she told the agent. "I'll be with her every step of the way." As we walked towards Sarah's car, I heard Margaret's voice behind me. "Linda, you can't just leave. What about me? What am I supposed to do?" I paused, turning to look at her one last time. The woman who had made my life a living hell for years now looked small and fragile, her carefully crafted facade crumbling in the face of reality. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. "You're a strong, independent woman, Margaret," I said, echoing the words she had so often used to criticize me. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." With that, I got into Sarah's car. As we drove away, I watched the house, my prison for so long, grow smaller in the rearview mirror. The future was uncertain, and I knew there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, I felt free. And that was worth everything. The police station was a flurry of activity when Sarah and I arrived. Officers bustled about, phones rang incessantly, and the air buzzed with a nervous energy that seemed to match my own internal state. As we were led to a small, nondescript room for questioning, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. This was all so surreal. Just this morning, I had been making coffee in my kitchen, and now I was giving a statement about my husband's criminal activities. Agent Carlson joined us a few minutes later, a thick file folder in his hands. He sat across from us, his face serious but not unkind. "Mrs. Bradshaw," he began, then paused. "Or would you prefer Ms. Cooper?" The question caught me off guard. It had been so long since anyone had called me by my maiden name that it sounded almost foreign to my ears. "Ms. Cooper is fine," I said after a moment. It felt right, like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd lost. The next few hours were grueling. I recounted everything I knew about Ethan's business dealings, every suspicious phone call I'd overheard, every odd bank statement I'd seen. Sarah was a constant presence at my side, advising me when to elaborate and when to keep my answers concise. By the time we finished, I felt drained, both physically and emotionally. "Thank you, Ms. Cooper," Agent Carlson said as he closed his notebook. "Your cooperation has been invaluable. We'll be in touch if we need any further information." As we left the station, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, but I barely noticed. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything that had happened. "Linda." Sarah's voice broke through my thoughts. "Are you okay? Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" I blinked, realizing I hadn't even considered that. I couldn't go back to the house, it was now a crime scene, and even if it wasn't, I couldn't bear the thought of facing Margaret alone. I don't know," I admitted, feeling suddenly lost. Sarah squeezed my arm gently. "You'll stay with me," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll figure everything else out tomorrow." That night, as I lay in Sarah's guest room staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, the full weight of the day's events finally hit me. Tears that I'd been holding back for hours, maybe even years, began to fall. I cried for the young, naive girl I'd been when I met Ethan. I cried for the dreams and hopes that had slowly withered under Margaret's constant criticism. I cried for the years I'd lost, trying to make a marriage work with a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenience. But mixed with the sorrow was a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. The constant fear, the walking on eggshells, the desperate need to please, it was all gone. In its place was a void, scary in its unfamiliarity, but also filled with possibility. The next few days passed in a blur of legal meetings, police interviews, and long conversations with Sarah about what to do next. The story had broken in the local news, and my phone was inundated with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, old friends, distant relatives, even my parents, who I hadn't talked to since my wedding day. It was overwhelming, to say the least. But with each passing day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like the Linda I used to be before Ethan and Margaret had ground me down. A week after Ethan's arrest, I finally worked up the courage to go back to the house. Sarah insisted on coming with me, which I was grateful for. As we pulled up to the curb, I saw that the police tape was gone, but the house still had an air of abandonment about it. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, devoid of Margaret's constant complaints or the sound of Ethan's football games blaring from the TV. It felt smaller somehow, less intimidating than I remembered. As I walked through the rooms, gathering the personal items I wanted to keep, memories flooded back. There, in the kitchen, was where Margaret had thrown that coffee cup at me. In the living room, the spot where Ethan had berated me for hours because dinner wasn't to his liking. Each room held its own painful history, but now, those memories seemed to have lost some of their power over me. I was in the bedroom, packing some clothes, when I heard the front door open. My heart leapt into my throat, but Sarah quickly called out, "It's just me, Linda. Everything okay?" I relaxed, realizing I'd been holding my breath. "Yeah," I called back. "I'm almost done up here." As I zipped up my suitcase, my eyes fell on a framed photo on the dresser. It was from our wedding day, Ethan and I, smiling broadly at the camera, Margaret standing just behind us with a proprietary hand on Ethan's shoulder. I picked up the frame, studying the faces. Had I ever really been that happy, or had I just convinced myself I was? With a sudden, decisive movement, I took the photo out of the frame and tore it in half, separating myself from Ethan and Margaret. It felt symbolic somehow, a physical representation of the break I was making from my old life. Downstairs, I found Sarah in the kitchen, looking through some papers she'd found on the counter. "Linda," she said, her voice serious, "you should see this." The papers turned out to be bank statements, accounts I'd never known existed, hidden away in offshore banks. The sums listed made my head spin. All this time, while I'd been scrimping and saving, terrified of overspending on groceries or household items, Ethan had been sitting on a fortune. "This changes things," Sarah said, her lawyer mode kicking in. "With this evidence, we can push for a much better settlement in the divorce." Divorce. The word hung in the air between us. It was the obvious next step, but hearing it said out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Okay," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "What do we do next?" The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, meetings with financial advisors, and long strategy sessions with Sarah. Ethan, facing overwhelming evidence, had agreed to a plea deal. The terms of our divorce were being hammered out, with Ethan's hidden assets now on the table. Through it all, I found myself growing stronger, more confident. The woman who had meekly accepted Margaret's abuse and Ethan's indifference was gone. In her place was someone new, or perhaps someone old, rediscovered. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were days when the magnitude of what had happened threatened to overwhelm me. Nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear Margaret's shrill voice or Ethan's heavy footsteps. But those moments became fewer and farther between as time passed. 1 month after Ethan's arrest, I stood in front of the mirror in my new apartment, a small, sunny place that I'd chosen for myself. I hardly recognized the woman looking back at me. Her eyes were clearer, her posture straighter. She looked happy. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, "Final divorce papers ready. Want to come sign them?" I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions wash over me. Fear, yes, but also excitement. This was it, the final step in closing this chapter of my life. As I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, I caught sight of something on my bookshelf. It was my old journal, the one where I'd documented all the abuse and manipulation. I picked it up, flipping through the pages filled with pain and despair. For a moment, I considered keeping it, a reminder of what I'd been through, what I'd overcome. But then I shook my head, tossing the journal into the trash can by the door. I didn't need reminders of my past pain. I had a future to look forward to. Stepping out into the bright summer day, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of consequences that had seemed so heavy at first had transformed into something else, the weight of freedom, of possibility, of a life reclaimed. And I was ready to bear that weight, one step at a time. The day I signed the final divorce papers was surreal. As I sat in Sarah's office, pen in hand, I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Relief, certainly. Fear, undoubtedly. But also a sense of anticipation, like I was standing on the edge of something new and exciting. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, I think I am." As I signed my name, my old name, Linda Cooper, on each designated line, I felt the last threads of my life with Ethan falling away. It was done. I was free. But freedom, I was quickly learning, came with its own set of challenges. The weeks following the finalization of my divorce were a whirlwind. The story of Ethan's arrest and subsequent conviction had made headlines not just in Millbrook, but in the surrounding counties as well. Suddenly, I found myself the subject of intense scrutiny and gossip. Walking down Main Street became an exercise in avoidance. I could feel the stares, hear the whispers. Some were sympathetic, others accusatory. Mrs. Johnson from next door stopped me one day outside the grocery store, clasping my hands in hers. "You poor dear," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "To think of what you've been through. You're so brave." I mumbled my thanks, uncomfortable with her pity but appreciative of her kindness. Not everyone was so understanding. Later that same week, I ran into Margaret's friend, Beatrice, at the local cafe. Her eyes narrowed as soon as she saw me, and she made a beeline for my table. "Well, if it isn't the little gold digger," she hissed, loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. "Are you happy now? You've ruined a good man's life and broken poor Margaret's heart." I felt my cheeks burn with anger and embarrassment. Part of me wanted to shrink away, to apologize, to fall back into old patterns. But I steeled myself, met her gaze, and spoke clearly. "I think you'll find, Beatrice, that Ethan ruined his own life. And as for Margaret's heart, well, I'm sure she'll manage. She always does." Beatrice's mouth fell open in shock. Before she could respond, I stood up, gathered my things, and walked out, my head held high. As the door closed behind me, I heard a smattering of applause from the other customers. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. These encounters, both positive and negative, became a regular part of my new life. Each one tested me, pushed me to stand firm in my decisions and my newfound strength. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, I felt more confident, more sure of myself. The legal aftermath of Ethan's crimes continued to unfold. His plea deal had resulted in a 15-year sentence, with the possibility of parole after 10. The company he had worked for was in shambles, its reputation in tatters. Former employees, many of whom had lost their jobs in the fallout, were struggling to rebuild their lives. I felt a responsibility to them, even though I knew logically that none of this was my fault. After much discussion with Sarah, I decided to use a portion of my divorce settlement to set up a fund for those affected by Ethan's fraud. It wasn't much, but it was something. A way to try and right some of the wrongs that had been done. The day we announced the fund, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I was shocked to hear Ethan's voice on the other end. "Linda," he said, his voice rough. I heard about the fund." I remained silent, unsure of what to say or how to feel. I just wanted to say, "Thank you. And I'm sorry. For everything." The line went dead before I could respond. I stood there, phone in hand, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't forgiveness, I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to fully forgive him, but it was something. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of the pain he'd caused. As the dust began to settle on the legal proceedings, I found myself faced with a new challenge, figuring out who I was outside of my roles as Ethan's wife and Margaret's daughter-in-law. For so long, my identity had been tied up in those relationships. Now, I had the freedom to rediscover myself, but that freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. I started small. I enrolled in a community college course, just one, to start with. It was an introductory psychology class, something I'd always been interested in but had never pursued. The first day I walked into that classroom, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But as I sat down, opened my notebook, and began to listen, I felt a spark of excitement ignite within me. That spark grew with each passing week. I found myself eagerly looking forward to classes, staying up late to read ahead in the textbook, engaging in lively discussions with my classmates. It was as if a part of my brain that had been dormant for years was suddenly awakening. Encouraged by this success, I branched out further. I joined a local book club, started volunteering at the animal shelter, even took up yoga. Each new activity, each new connection I made, helped me build a clearer picture of who Linda Cooper really was. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were still days when the weight of everything that had happened threatened to overwhelm me. Nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing from nightmares of Ethan's anger or Margaret's cutting words. In those moments, I would reach for the phone and call Sarah, or sometimes my sister Kate, who I'd reconnected with after years of estrangement. Slowly but surely, I was building a support system, a network of people who cared about me, who supported me, who saw me for who I truly was. It was a stark contrast to the isolation I'd experienced in my marriage, and it made me realize just how alone I'd been all those years. One day, about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter from Margaret. My hands shook as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. The contents surprised me. "Linda," it read, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I hope you'll read this letter in its entirety. These past months have forced me to do a lot of soul-searching. I've had to confront some hard truths about myself, about Ethan, and about the way we treated you. I won't ask for your forgiveness, I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I am truly sorry for the pain I caused you. I hope that you're finding happiness and peace in your new life. You deserve it. Margaret." I read the letter several times, my emotions swinging wildly between anger, sadness, and a strange sort of relief. It didn't erase the years of abuse, but it was an acknowledgement. A closing of a chapter. That night, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over Millbrook. The town looked different to me now, no longer a prison, but a place of possibility. I thought about how far I'd come, about the woman I was becoming. The future was still uncertain. I didn't know where my newfound interests might lead me, what new challenges I might face. But for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. The unraveling of my old life had been painful, yes, but it had also been necessary. It had cleared the way for something new, something authentically mine. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, I made a promise to myself. No matter what came next, I would face it head-on. I would continue to grow, to learn, to become the woman I was always meant to be. The unraveling wasn't an end, I realized. It was just the beginning. As the seasons changed and a year passed since my divorce, I found myself standing at the threshold of a new chapter in my life. The wounds of the past were slowly healing, leaving behind scars that served as reminders of my strength rather than my pain. My psychology course had ignited a passion I never knew I had. With encouragement from my professor and support from Sarah, I made the decision to enroll full-time at Millbrook Community College. At 35, I was older than most of my classmates, but that didn't deter me. If anything, my life experiences gave me a unique perspective that enriched class discussions and deepened my understanding of the material. One crisp autumn morning, as I was hurrying across campus to my developmental psychology class, I quite literally ran into Dr. James Parker, the head of the psychology department. My books went flying, and I stammered out an apology as we both knelt to gather them. "No harm done, Ms. Cooper," he said with a kind smile, handing me my well-worn copy of Theories of Personality. "Actually, I'm glad I ran into you. Do you have a moment?" Curiosity piqued, I nodded, and we moved to a nearby bench. Dr. Parker explained that the department was looking for a research assistant for an upcoming project on resilience in the face of domestic abuse. Given my academic performance and personal background, he thought I might be interested. I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The opportunity was incredible, but it would mean delving into issues that hit very close to home. Dr. Parker must have sensed my hesitation. "Take some time to think about it," he said gently. "This kind of research can be emotionally challenging, but it can also be incredibly rewarding. And Linda," he added, his eyes serious, "your experiences give you insights that could be invaluable to this project." I promised to consider it and headed to class, my mind whirling with possibilities. That evening, I called Sarah to discuss the opportunity. "It sounds perfect for you," she said after I explained everything. "But are you sure you're ready to revisit all of that?" I took a deep breath, considering her question. "I think I am," I said slowly. "It won't be easy, but if I can use my experiences to help others, to contribute to understanding and maybe even prevention, well, that would give some meaning to everything I went through, wouldn't it?" Sarah's voice was warm with pride when she replied, "I think you've just made your decision, Linda. And for what it's worth, I think you're going to be amazing." The next day, I accepted Dr. Parker's offer. As I threw myself into the research, I found that Sarah was right. It wasn't easy. There were days when reading case studies or conducting interviews would bring back vivid memories of my life with Ethan and Margaret. But there were also moments of profound connection with the women we were studying, moments when I could see the impact our work could have. As winter melted into spring, I found myself busier than I'd ever been, but also happier. My days were filled with classes, research, and my continued volunteer work at the animal shelter. I was building a life that was truly my own, shaped by my choices and passions. It was during this time that I received another unexpected letter, this one from Ethan. Unlike Margaret's letter, which had been a surprise but not entirely unwelcome, seeing Ethan's handwriting on the envelope made my stomach churn. For days, I left the letter unopened on my kitchen counter, unsure whether I even wanted to know its contents. Finally, with Sarah by my side for moral support, I decided to read it. "Dear Linda," it began. "I've started this letter 100 times, never knowing quite what to say. I'm sorry seems woefully inadequate, but it's the truth. I am sorry. Sorry for the way I treated you, for the years I stole from you, for every unkind word and thoughtless action. My time in here has forced me to confront the man I became, and I don't like what I see. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I hope you can find some peace. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. I hope you're finding that now. Ethan." Tears streamed down my face as I finished reading. They weren't tears of sadness or anger, but of release. It felt as if the last knot of tension I'd been carrying had finally unraveled. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her hand on my shoulder. I nodded, wiping my eyes. "I think I am. I think I can finally let go now." That night, I wrote a response to Ethan. I didn't absolve him of his actions, but I did tell him about my new life, about the research I was doing. I told him that while I couldn't forget the past, I was no longer letting it define my future. It was the last time I would ever write to him, but it felt like an important step in my healing process. As spring bloomed into summer, my life took another unexpected turn. Dr. Parker approached me about presenting our research at a conference in New York City. The idea both thrilled and terrified me. Public speaking had never been my strong suit, and the thought of standing in front of a room full of professionals made my palms sweat. But I thought of how far I'd come, of all the challenges I'd already overcome. This was just one more mountain to climb. So, with butterflies in my stomach, I agreed. The weeks leading up to the conference were a blur of preparation. I practiced my presentation endlessly, refining my delivery and anticipating potential questions. Sarah helped me shop for a new outfit, something professional yet confident. "You want to look the part of the rising academic star you are," she said with a wink. When the day finally arrived, I stood backstage, my heart pounding. As I waited for my introduction, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I thought of the frightened, insecure woman I'd been just 2 years ago, and marveled at the journey that had brought me here. And now, presenting their research on resilience in survivors of domestic abuse, please welcome Linda Cooper and Dr. James Parker. As I walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding me, I felt a surge of confidence. This was my moment, and I was ready for it. The presentation went better than I could have hoped. As I spoke about our findings, illustrating them with anonymized stories from our research subjects, I could see the audience leaning in, engaged and responsive. When it came time for questions, I fielded them with a calm assurance that surprised even me. Afterwards, as Dr. Parker and I were surrounded by colleagues eager to discuss our work, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see a woman about my age, her eyes brimming with tears. "Ms. Cooper," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. Your research, your words, they gave me hope. I'm in a situation similar to what you described, and I've been scared to leave. But listening to you, I think I can be brave too." I felt my own eyes well up as I clasped her hand. "You are brave," I told her firmly. "Braver than you know. And you're not alone." As she walked away, Dr. Parker squeezed my shoulder. "That," he said, "is why we do this work." That night, as I stood on the balcony of my hotel room, looking out over the twinkling lights of New York City, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. My life had taken a path I never could have imagined, full of pain and struggle, yes, but also growth and triumph. I thought of the woman from the conference, of all the women like her who were still fighting their own battles. I thought of my students back in Millbrook, of the research that still lay ahead. I thought of Sarah, of Dr. Parker, of all the people who had supported me on this journey. As the first light of dawn began to peek over the horizon, I smiled to myself. This was more than just a new day. It was a new dawn, the beginning of a life filled with purpose and possibility. And I was ready to embrace every moment of it. The path ahead would undoubtedly have its own challenges and obstacles. But I knew now that I had the strength to face them. I was no longer the woman who lived in fear of Ethan's moods or Margaret's cruel words. I was Linda Cooper, survivor, student, researcher, friend. And my story was far from over. As the sun rose fully, bathing the city in golden light, I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. Whatever came next, I was ready. This was my new dawn, and I intended to make the most of every ray of light it brought.